the Han Chinese and the Uyghurs, and for advocating respect for religious and cultural belief of our people and for equal opportunity in pursuing our dreams and the things that motivate us. My father is a noble and honest man with a big heart. He dedicated his life to teaching what he learned and helping people in need. But over 8 years ago, on February 2nd, 2013, my father was stopped at the airport from leaving the country. And yes, I remember the date so clearly. My father and I were on our way to America together. He was to be a visiting scholar at Indiana University, and I was a teenager and was only planning to stay in the US for 2 to 3 weeks and help my father settle down. But as you can see, I'm still here and never left. I'm now on the other side of the world, away from my family and my home. And that was the last time I saw my father and my younger brothers. January 15th, 2014, another date that I would never forget. 11 months after we were separated at the airport, more than 20 policemen broke into our apartment in Beijing and arrested my father in front of my 2 little brothers, who were 4 and 7 years old. My poor little brothers were deeply traumatized and had to grow up without a father figure for over 7 years. My stepmother had to raise 2 boys all on her own, and I had to live away from my father and family on the other side of the world for the past 8 years. It has been 4 years since I haven't heard any news of my father. None of my family members were able to visit my father since 2017. When my father was first arrested in 2014, he was shackled, beaten, and denied for food twice, each time for 10 days. My family and I have deep concerns over his current safety and his health condition. In fact, we don't even know if he is alive. The treatment of an internationally known scholar like my father is already this cruel. I wonder how cruel the situation and conditions are for the other Uyghurs who don't have family relatives that are able to speak up for them overseas, and for those who are not able to let their stories and names to be told to the world. Over the past few years, I have learned that it has been estimated by scholars and researchers that Chinese government has rounded up over 1 to 1.8 million Uyghurs and other Turkic and Muslim majority peoples and been sending them to prison camps, labor camps, or what the Chinese government calls vocational training schools. Some have been transported away from home to other parts of China, where people have been working in factories under conditions that strongly indicate forced labor. Those are systematic and state-sponsored forms of forced labor, which intersects with other types of egregious human rights abuses, which includes undermining the Uyghur customs and culture, widespread arbitrary detention, political indoctrination and transformation, family separation, pervasive surveillance, forced sterilization, and gender-based sexual harassment. The Chinese government claims that those so-called vocational training schools with barbed fences and watchtowers are for vocational training and poverty alleviation purposes. I wish that was the truth. I really wish so. But unfortunately, the truth that I learned is that families have been separated, hearts have been torn, children and wives are screaming and crying for the missing or the loss of their fathers, husbands, brothers, uncles, aunts, sisters, cousins, and mothers. I may have told my father's story, the Uyghurs' plight to the world, if not 500 times for the past 7 years, then at least 100 times. But our voices still haven't been heard. My father is still serving a life sentence in a Chinese prison. Hundreds of thousands, even millions of Uyghurs are still being targeted. The fate of my father and my community is in the world's hands now. We all need to join together and take action to stop this humanitarian crisis from continuing. This needs to stop. Thank you.
Jewher, thank you very much for that very powerful and poignant story about your family and the situation that you and they find themselves in. We are now going to switch to have opening remarks from the 3 permanent representatives to the UN from the UK, the US, and Germany. And we're going to start. I would like to introduce Ambassador Barbara Woodward, who is the British Ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dimitri, and thank you, Jewher. The last time I was in Xinjiang in 2015, we did ask about your father's case, but as you know, sadly, we have had no more news, and thank you for your powerful and compelling testimony. And as you set out, this is a wider situation, probably one of the worst human rights crises of our time. The evidence from a growing number of credible sources, including satellite imagery, survivor testimony, and publicly available Chinese government documents, causes us grave concern. The evidence, as you said, Jewher, points to a program of repression of specific ethnic groups. Expressions of religion have been criminalized, and Uyghur language and culture are discriminated against systematically and at scale. As we will hear today, and we've already heard from Jewher, there is evidence of mass arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, and instances of torture. There are also, as we've heard, reports of widespread forced labor and of forced sterilization. We're here today to discuss these issues and to ask China to allow immediate, meaningful, and unfettered access to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and her office. To prevent her access asks the question, why? Here at the UN, we must uphold the human rights, the values, and the principles that are at the heart of the Charter, which begins, "We the peoples." So together with our partners, we call on China to respect and uphold international human rights law and the rights and freedoms guaranteed under its own constitution. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Woodward. We will now turn to the American Ambassador to the UN, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield. Ambassador, good morning, welcome, and the floor is now yours.
Good, thank you, Dimitri. And let me start by thanking all of our guests for joining us today and all of our co-hosts and speakers for bringing attention to this important issue. And thank you especially to Jewher for your remarks, for your determination, and for your courage. Yesterday, I spoke to Rayhan Assad, whose brother Ekpar is one of the more than 1 million Uyghur people who have been detained in Xinjiang. Before his detention, Ekpar was held up as a model citizen, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist dedicated to helping older people and people with disabilities. In the latest video Ekpar's family has seen, he looks gaunt, a shadow of his former self. He is just one of many victims of the atrocities of Xinjiang. In Xinjiang, people are being tortured. Women are being forcibly sterilized. There are incredible reports that many Uyghur people and other ethnic and religious minorities who only wish to practice basic freedom of religion, belief, expression, and movement are being forced to work until they drop manufacturing clothes and goods at the behest of the state. The New York Times reported that the goal is to, as one official put it, break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections, and break their origins. Rayhan reminded me that this violence doesn't just dehumanize the people it's inflicted upon. It also dehumanizes anyone who stands by and let it happen. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights begins with the word universal for a reason. Indeed, the foundational unit of the United Nations from the first sentence of the Charter is not just the nation state, it is also the human being. Today, we have heard and will continue to hear how the rights of Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang are being abused and violated to the extreme. The victims of these abuses aren't just victims. They are heroes whose strength and bravery should serve as an example to all. We will keep standing up and speaking out until China's government stops its crimes against humanity and the genocide of Uyghurs and other minorities in Xinjiang. And we will keep working in concert with our allies and our partners until China's government respect the universal human rights of all its people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield. Finally, let me introduce the German ambassador to the UN, Christoph Heusken. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you, Dimitri. Thank you for leading us through today's event. Jewher, thank you so much for your remarks and for reminding us of your wonderful father who has tried to do so much for unity in your country. Your shocking account underlines once more why this event is so important and timely. It doesn't happen very often that so many of the major non-governmental organizations, so many countries join forces to organize an event like the one of today. It demonstrates the gravity of the situation of the oppressed Uyghur and other Turkic Muslim minorities in Xinjiang. And I want to thank all co-sponsors who came together despite some massive Chinese threats. Let me be clear and echo what Barbara and Linda just said. Human rights are universal, and all UN member states have the unconditional obligation to respect them. From what we heard already and from what we hear today, this is clearly not the case in Xinjiang. We appeal on China to respect the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we ask China to tear down the detention camps. If you have nothing to hide, why don't you finally grant unimpeded access to the High Commissioner for Human Rights? Dear colleagues, despite the pressure exerted on many of us, let's commit to continue our efforts until the Uyghurs and all the Turkic Muslim minorities can live again in freedom, until they are no longer detained, no longer victims of forced labor and other human rights abuses, until they can exercise the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And once again, thank you to all three ambassadors for your opening remarks. We are now going to move to the part of the program where we have two panels on which we'll hear from a range of experts. Our first panel is going to examine the situation in Xinjiang and how the UN should respond to what's happening. And I would like to welcome the leaders of two preeminent human rights organizations. We have Kenneth Roth, who is the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, and we have Dr. Agnes Kalamar, who is the Secretary General of Amnesty International. Ken, I think we are going to give you the floor first for your opening remarks. Good morning and welcome.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. And thank you as well to all of the co-sponsors, both governmental and non-governmental, of this extremely important event. Now, despite the Chinese government's efforts to cover up what's happening in Xinjiang, the facts are increasingly well known. More than 1 million Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims have been detained to force them to renounce their culture and their religion. A highly intrusive surveillance state has been created to determine whom should be detained. And people are often detained for as little as wearing a beard or having contacts abroad or being too religious. There's an increasing use of forced labor, which is infecting cotton and apparel industries, especially since the Chinese government is blocking independent monitoring of those supply chains. There is a reported shocking reduction in the birth rate, more than 48%, compared to a slight rise in Chinese Han areas. That's unprecedented according to UN statistics, more than the reduction even during the Syrian civil war or the Rwandan genocide. Now, Human Rights Watch recently found that this combination of atrocities amounts to the crime against humanity of persecution, a deliberate effort to deprive of the most fundamental rights the people of these regions, the Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims, in order to snuff out their culture and their religion. Now, the Chinese government claims that this is about fighting terrorism. But frankly, Beijing doesn't even pretend that this is a targeted effort. This sweeping, broad-based persecution is a blatant attack on Islam and on Uyghur culture. Terrorism is a feeble pretext. Now, the real challenge that we face today is what to do about all of this. Beijing clearly calculates that through censorship, propaganda, intimidations, and threats, it can somehow avoid accountability. It threatens anyone who speaks about Xinjiang. It went to the extraordinary length of disinviting people from today's important event, even though the Chinese mission turned around and asked to speak here itself. It uses absurd euphemisms, such as calling the mass detention centers that scar the landscape of Xinjiang so-called vocational training centers. It circulates embarrassing propaganda about a Xinjiang filled with people who are happily immersed in song and dance. It has led the UN High Commissioner through an endless charade of negotiations for unfettered access, clearly hoping that she will never get around to reporting. It pretends that she's welcome to visit at any time, but it means yet another show tour rather than the unfettered investigation that she rightfully insists upon. It has reduced the UN Secretary General to a disturbing silence over one of the world's gravest human rights crimes. It has devoted $1 trillion to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is trumpeted as providing no strings attached loans, meaning none of the anti-corruption requirements of transparency that the World Bank insists upon. But these loans are laden with strings, with conditions regarding the need to avoid criticizing Beijing for its atrocities in Xinjiang and to vote with Beijing to quash any UN resolution on China. Now, sadly, Beijing's extraordinary effort has indeed allowed it so far to proceed with impunity. But the good news is that the tide seems to be turning. Growing numbers of states have been willing to join together to find safety in numbers to condemn these grave abuses. Most recently, the 39 governments last October during the UN General Assembly's Third Committee that denounced what's happening in Xinjiang. Today's hearing, co-sponsored by 18 governments, is another important step forward. But there's more that we must do. Will we accept a UN Secretary General whose calculated strategy of her second term involves public silence on Xinjiang? Will we encourage the UN High Commissioner, while she engages in endless negotiations for unfettered access to Xinjiang, to begin publishing her findings now? She can do that based on remote monitoring, as her office has done for Myanmar and North Korea, and indeed as Human Rights Watch has repeatedly done for Xinjiang. As an aside, I've got to say that I'm disappointed that the High Commissioner chose not to attend today's hearing. I'm sure she's busy, we all are, but I have a similar global mandate to defend human rights, and I couldn't think of anything more important to do than to join you here today. I certainly wasn't deterred by the commute all the way to my laptop. Now, we should start by pressing for a UN resolution on Xinjiang, most logically at the UN Human Rights Council. Crimes against humanity deserve a commission of inquiry to collect the evidence and to build the case for prosecution. At minimum, we should press for a resolution of condemnation. Now, I know that won't be easy. It will require active outreach to nations of all regions. But if we could build a global coalition to defend Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, we should be able to build a global coalition to defend Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Yes, the persecutor is much more powerful, but rights should not vary according to the violator. While Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have silenced the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, I hope that the Muslim majority members will step forward, as some have begun to do. Even at the UN Security Council, our aim should be to move today's discussion to the formal halls of the Council. A resolution is obviously impossible in light of China's veto, but a procedural vote to place Xinjiang formally on the Security Council's agenda should be possible. Given that China's veto also blocks access to the International Criminal Court, we should examine alternative avenues to justice, such as the use of universal jurisdiction that several European governments have already done so effectively when ICC access for Syrian war crimes was similarly blocked. And we should consider creating an international investigative mechanism for Xinjiang, similar to what has been done for Syria and Myanmar. We should tighten rules on supply chains to reverse the presumption of ignorance. Given the pervasiveness of Uyghur Muslim forced labor in Xinjiang, and given the Chinese government's refusal to allow independent monitoring, no news is not good news. No news should be assumed to mean a supply chain's complicity in forced labor. No one should import from Xinjiang directly or indirectly under such circumstances. Ignorance is no longer an excuse. In short, there are things that we can do to break the impunity that the Chinese government's censorship, bluster, and threats have sought to undermine. Today is a very important step in that process, but it is only an early step. The true test of the significance of today's event will be the follow-up steps that we all take. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ken. And now let me welcome Agnes. Agnes, the floor is yours. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. Many thanks to the organizers, specifically to the Excellencies Ambassador Barbara Woodward, Linda Thomas Greenfield, and Christopher Ogson for their hard work and support to make this event happen, as well as to the other 18 state co-sponsors of this event and many organizations of civil society. I'm sorry, I think what I'm going to say is very much a repetition of what you've just heard from Kenneth in particular, but also from the ambassadors before me. This event provides the international community and UN member states an unfortunately all too rare opportunity to take stock of the situation in Xinjiang province in China and to work decisively towards much needed action for accountability. The facts have already been well presented by Ken in particular. Since 2017, there is an estimated 1 million or more Uyghur and other predominantly Muslim ethnic minority residents of Xinjiang who have been arbitrarily detained in so-called euphemistically called transformation through education or vocational training center. Under the guise of countering terrorism and religious extremism, mass incarceration for the purpose of re-education has been combined with pervasive, intrusive surveillance, along with effort to erase cultural and religious identity in a state-led campaign to assimilate the ethnic population of Xinjiang into an homogeneous Chinese nation, possessing a single language, uniform culture, and unquestioning loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. The detainees in the so-called re-education facilities have been subjected to various forms of torture and ill treatment, and we unfortunately have heard a very personal account of that. They have also been subjected to programs for political indoctrination and forced cultural assimilation. These are some of the violations that Amnesty International, along with others, has documented. In addition, we have also documented many cases of families torn apart by the repression perpetrated in Xinjiang. To avoid falling under suspicion, many of those living inside Xinjiang have cut off contact with loved ones living elsewhere. Parents of children left in Xinjiang to stay with relatives are experiencing the nightmare of their children being sent to state-run orphan camp. Members of the Uyghur diaspora have a well-founded fear that if they return, they will be detained immediately and sent for re-education. Some face deportation even from their country of residence whenever the Chinese government refuses to renew their travel document overseas. The Chinese government policies and practice in Xinjiang violate multiple human rights, rights to liberty and security of person, rights to privacy, to freedom of movement, to opinion and expression, to thought, conscience, religious and belief, to participate in cultural life, to family life, and to equality and non-discrimination. Those abuses, as Kenneth have described, are carried out in a widespread and systematic manner. So that for millions of members of ethnic minorities, they have become an inexorable element of daily life in their region. Millions of people live under continuous threat. The gravity of the situation is further evident in China's many threats, intimidation and reprisal against anyone, and I mean anyone, state, corporate actors, NGOs, media, activists, individuals who dare question, report, or denounce the human rights situation in Xinjiang. Some threats are public and made out in the open, in social media, or communicated through various platforms. They seek to silence those that speak up. Many, however, of those threats are delivered clandestinely. China's economic might is put to a particular use right now to induce support from other member states as they seek to disguise and deny human rights violation in Xinjiang and working to ensure that no accountability is demanded of them as a P5 member. That conduct is anti-ethical to what the multilateral system stands for and to what it deserves. To hear that just last week, on the occasion of the century of the Chinese Communist Party anniversary, the Secretary General of the UN chose to compliment China for its commitment to multilateralism, underscores just how much the system itself, its values, ideals, and standards are being gravely undermined, including by those whose mandate it is to put them forward and to implement them. In addition to intimidating and threatening others, China has effectively restricted UN access to the region, blocked relevant action within and by UN institutions. In fact, unlike many member states, the government of China has not issued, for instance, a standing invitation to UN independent experts to conduct official visits, which also underline their very biased understanding of multilateralism. China goes to great lengths, it seems, to cover up what is happening in Xinjiang. If our effort fail to secure the action needed for an independent investigatory mechanism, there is a real risk that this cover-up will succeed. And yet, despite these bully boy tactics, there is evidence that support for a multilateral response to the human rights situation is growing. I'm not going to repeat them. Kenneth has already highlighted them for you. I should just conclude maybe by saying that China's violation in Xinjiang are a particular critical test for the international human rights system. It concerns the P5 members. It involves credible allegations of massive human rights violations committed by a government against its own people, and those violations are on a huge scale. If the United Nations cannot manage to even investigate those actions, and frankly, doubts about its ability to hold anyone accountable will only deepen. Yes, in the past, UN investigation of violations by other P5 members have been hampered and not always to the extent that we would have wanted them to be, but there has been some investigation. Right now, this is not the case. Investigation open public by the UN into the violations in Xinjiang must take place in one way or another, as Kenneth has pointed out, either by going there or by doing remote investigation. The silence, fear, and timidity of the OHCHR and UN Secretariat are frankly unacceptable and a breach of their mandate, as are the silence of many states. My plea to you, to the state that may not be in the room, but hopefully will listen to that. Do not let China's portrayal of critiques define your motivation. Supporting a multilateral response to what is happening in Xinjiang is not about picking side in a fight with China or supporting the US or anyone else. It is about fighting for human rights and for a human rights and international system that is working for everyone. The Human Rights Council too must be bold. It must hold a special session or an urgent debate to adopt a resolution establishing an independent international mechanism to investigate the crime. And so should the United Nations Security Council in terms of holding regular formal meetings on the situation there. And there are other mechanisms, as Ken has pointed out. Silence, heads in the sand, and unseemly concessions embolden China, tarnish the human rights system, weaken the UN overall, and betrays our duty to the people of China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're on a tight schedule this morning, but I think we have time maybe for one question for both of you. Agnes, if I can start with you, just to help people who may not be familiar in depth with what's happening in Xinjiang and the gravity of the situation, what do you think is the best historical comparison to what's happening in Xinjiang? And then relatedly, how does the pressure on China and the Chinese response and counter pressure compare to the situation after the massacre in Tiananmen Square in 1989? Agnes, I think you're still on mute, if you could, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. This is an extraordinarily complex question. The historical reference is a minefield, I will suggest. So let me just say, look, we have had over the life history of the human rights system, many examples of massive violation directed at the people of a country. And that's what is happening right now. They are very large in scale. They touch many kinds of violations and they target minority groups. So I think my colleagues, special rapporteur on minorities who will speak afterwards, I think probably will be better able to make any kind of historical analysis of that particular form of targeting of that group and what it means historically, either in China or outside. I don't know whether Ken wants to give an historical analysis.
Well, maybe Ken, just before you weigh in, let me just ask my question to you, and then maybe you could wrap the two together. So what I want to ask you is, the Biden administration has labeled the situation in Xinjiang as genocide. The UK, Canadian, and Dutch parliaments have also done that. Why have more countries around the world either not taken that step or more steps than they have already? What is holding them back?
Well, look, I think it's worth noting that what's going on in Xinjiang is clearly an example of crimes against humanity, which is very severe. There's this tendency to feel that if you don't call it genocide, it's not really bad. That's wrong. Crimes against humanity is awful. And so that should be sufficient to motivate action. Whether there's the intent to eradicate in whole or in part a religious or ethnic group, which is, the requirement of genocide, you can debate that. I think if you look at sort of the reduction in births, which is the key evidence people cite, it's still not clear whether that's a consequence of the detention or whether that's a deliberate policy through forced sterilization and the like. This is something we need to be investigating. But in terms of the severity of the crime, it shouldn't matter. This is the crime against humanity.
Absolutely.
So it requires dedicated response. And Dima, you'd asked about Tiananmen Square. I mean, I think Beijing learned a lesson from Tiananmen Square. I mean, a Human Rights Watch researcher was in Tiananmen Square at the time when the shooting was happening. The world saw that. And the lesson Beijing took from that is commit your atrocities in silence. Put up a curtain. Don't let anybody in other than for show tours. But the big advantage that we have is it's no longer possible to hide crimes of this magnitude. We have satellite imagery. We're able to interview people who come and go from Xinjiang by going to places like Kazakhstan. We've gotten a hold of the handheld monitoring devices that the police use to input data on Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We have Chinese government documents describing what's happening. This is not a secret. So we shouldn't be hiding behind ignorance. We know what's going on. And the issue is, will we stand up to China, even though it's economically powerful, even though it's willing to use blackmail and threats and intimidation to try to silence governments? Do governments recognize that this is so severe that they've got to do the right thing as a matter of principle?
Thank you very much. So I'm afraid we have to wrap up the first panel. We're going to go straight into the next one, which is going to look at a little bit more the evidence of the human rights violations in Xinjiang. And I would like to welcome our three panelists. We have Professor Eva Pilz, who's a professor of law at King's College, London. We have Dr. Fernand de Varenne, UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. And once again, Jewher Ilham, author and human rights activist, who you heard from at the top of the program. So welcome to all three of you. Professor Pilz, are you? Yes, I can see. China has, can I ask you, China has pushed back very hard against the allegations of persecution of the Uyghurs. Can you give us a summary of the main evidence that we have and why you think the Chinese rebuttals do not withstand scrutiny?
Thank you very much. Thank you for including me on the panel. And before I go into answering that question, I just wanted to thank especially Jewher for your contribution, and also say that Jewher, meeting your father in Beijing a few years ago was one of the absolute highlights of my research in Beijing. So thank you for asking about the body of evidence. And I think that we can only sketch out the available evidence, but fundamentally the various reports that have engaged with the question of responsibility under the Genocide Convention and also international criminal law, in particular crimes against humanity, have drawn on what is I think, quite rapidly increasing body of evidence, including the early evidence of satellite imagery that allowed us to see that camps were being built in Xinjiang, including various sources of leaked official documents that have given us insight into the purpose for which these camps and other policies were introduced, and that have allowed us, for instance, to understand some of the language being used by the Chinese authorities, such as eradicating tumors to describe the effort, the attempt to eradicate what is regarded as extremist religious ideology, but in fact, as we have heard from Kenneth Roth, is indeed only manifestation of the Muslim religion. Evidence has also included an increasing body of witness testimony, and there I think it is really important to realize that we are able, even while being denied access to Xinjiang, to gain access to survivors who have left China and who are able to speak to us directly about their experience, or also about the experience of their relatives, although certainly that is an attempt that is being suppressed by the Chinese authorities going after Uyghurs and other ethno-religious minorities in the diaspora by intimidating them, threatening them, and sadly very often including using violence against their family members in order to control them remotely. I think that from my perspective, the evidence for mass crimes is no longer a huge question, in the sense that there is sufficient evidence to ground a very strong conclusion that crimes against humanity are being perpetrated. The biggest difficulty, as was mentioned earlier on, of course, is about evaluating the available evidence in terms of genocidal intent. And from my perspective, if I may just quickly say that, I think it is important to see that I fully agree with Kenneth Roth's assessment that crimes against humanity is a very, very serious conclusion. And that from my perspective, the various reports that reach a conclusion that there's also evidence to support a finding of genocide. These reflect reasonable disagreement about a very complex, a very rapidly evolving situation that, of course, we cannot understand fully while being denied access to so many of the facts. From my perspective, that actually is very much a situation that supports the call for creating a mechanism at UN level to investigate the ongoing systematic human rights violations and suspected crimes. And I think that that is all the more important because, of course, also there is a serious concern that what is happening currently in Xinjiang is not confined to Xinjiang. We see, well, in one sense, of course, the whole of Chinese society is affected by the severe censorship and disinformation and propaganda that disables domestic civil society responses to the crimes in Xinjiang. But also there are expanding techniques and technologies of surveillance, of control, expanding from Xinjiang into the whole of China. And then there's also an international dimension to the attempt to control the narrative. As we have just already heard, there are persistent attempts to undermine and stop the effort to create fora like today's one. There are attempts to intimidate research and advocacy through sanctions and other measures. And I think all of that really contributes to the conclusion and makes for a very strong argument for creating an independent UN-based mechanism to assess the evidence and address the very complex legal questions that we have to address. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fernand, if I could come to you and maybe build a little bit upon what we've just heard. What kind of discussions have member states had with China about getting unfettered access to Xinjiang? And in the absence of that unfettered or real access, what other kind of mechanisms do you think can be employed to deal with the situation? For example, do you think there should be an appointment of a special rapporteur on China? Or what would you recommend?
Thank you very much, Dimitri. I would answer that not on focusing on member states, but on identifying some of the efforts of the United Nations itself. You may remember that in late March, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, talked about the negotiations with Beijing to allow the High Commissioner to visit the region I think that was initiated, actually started in last February, following reports, and we've had many reports, if I have time to raise these, reports of arbitrary detention, ill treatment, sexual violence, forced labor in Xinjiang, reports in relation, of course, to the massive scale of detention and so-called re-education activities. And in order to have a thorough and independent assessment that could be conducted by the High Commissioner. This was referred to earlier. Obviously, and I think it has also been mentioned, China has stopped very short of inviting an unrestricted investigation. In a sense, we could say that the government of China has been quite consistent in their position, though I would like to point out that the government of Russia, for example, has accepted that I myself, as the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, conduct an independent mission to that country in 2022. I've also requested an independent mission to the United States in the near future. Those countries are actually favorable to to having an independent mission. So I mentioned this, or I raised this, because I'm not sure why, when we have countries such as the United States and Russia, among many others, who accept and understand the need, the importance of an independent mission, why this is less understood or acceptable for China, which asserts, by the way, that it has made much progress in many social and economic areas. The second aspect of your question, there are in fact precedents where the United Nations has at times established mechanisms to collect and preserve evidence of what I would call massive human rights violations. This has occurred in the past either under the Security Council, and this can take the form of commissions of experts, investigative teams. It has emanated also from the General Assembly with international, impartial, and independent mechanisms. It has occurred with, and I think it's been also mentioned earlier, through the UN Human Rights Council, either with an independent international fact-finding mission or a newer mechanism to collect evidence, as has occurred, I think, with Sri Lanka. Mm-hmm. So there are, in fact, a number of mechanisms, tools that are possible. We have significant acceptance of the idea of independent country missions by special rapporteurs, including from Russia and the United States very recently, focusing on minorities. And given the scale of what we have been hearing, or the allegations that have been made, I must admit it seems very timid, and I would acknowledge it seems very timid from the side of the United Nations not to be more vocal and assertive, and trying to obtain collaboration from the government of China in this regard. And if I can allow myself to just perhaps finish here, I have a lot more I could share with you on specific allegations that my mandate and other special rapporteurs have been dealing with recently in relation to the Uyghurs in China. Mm-hmm. Let me just make one small statement. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And there's a heck of a lot of smoke right now, affecting hundreds of thousands of people, most of them minorities, most of them Muslims, and most of them Uyghurs. And I think it is time for all of us, for the international community, but also for the United Nations, to actually seize this situation of massive allegations of human rights, to try to protect equally the human rights of those who are often less able to protect themselves, minorities, whether it's in China, whether it is in any other country around the world, west, east, north, and south. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Finally, Jewher, I just want to ask you about one issue that actually you and I have talked about separately for some stories that we've done, which is on forced labor. Could you talk a little bit about, what kind of forced labor are we talking about? What industries are being most, dragged into this? And how do workers, if they can, get themselves out of these forced labor situations? Is there a way out, or once you're in there, are you stuck and it just continues?
Thank you very much, Dimitri, for your questions. At the moment, with over 20% of the world's cotton output being sourced from the Uyghur region, the apparel and textile industries are at a very high risk of being implicated in Uyghur forced labor. To be fair, virtually the entire apparel industry is tainted by forced labor and by forced Uyghur and Turkic Muslim labors. Credible investigations and reports by Associated Press, the ASPI report, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and also there were reports from Global Legal Action Network and Wall Street Journal. They have all linked apparel brands and a specific retailers to specific cases of Uyghur forced labor. But however, given the systematic use of and widespread use of Uyghur forced labor in the Uyghur region and other regions in China, there are significant risks of Uyghurs are forced in other types of sectors beyond apparel and textiles, which include other sectors that are possibly at high risk, includes polysilicon, and which are used to produce solar panels, and food industries such as tomatoes, electronics, hair products, and paper pulps. And also it's not limited to other sectors, but at the moment, there have been reports on those specific sectors that I have mentioned earlier. And with your question on where do if people are managed to get out of this those camps, where do they go? There are very limited testimonies from previous workers, but there are testimonies and evidence where people share their experiences. And it has been extremely difficult to conduct interviews because the mechanisms that brands and retailers and independent labor rights inspectors would normally use to investigate possible forced labor situations is usually, it's impossible because the Chinese government has placed the entire region in vice grip of repression and surveillance. So it makes it impossible for any worker who's suffering coercion or who had suffered coercion to tell the truth to an investigator if they're still remaining in China. And there were reports of that attempts to perform due diligence, but yielded unreliable results. There have been several cases that were reported in the Uyghur region facilities with very clear examples of forced labor, but it passed the audits and inspections. So the auditing results are no longer trustworthy at the moment. And there have, I don't know if I can use the word lucky. There have been some cases that where workers have luckily been able to get out of China, and they were very brave enough to tell investigators and researchers about their experiences. And the situation that they had described, it's horrific. And English is my third language, so I can't even find a proper word to describe their testimonies. And I have heard those testimonies and I wake up in cold sweats, and it still, sometimes it haunts me at night. Except my father, my cousin is also locked up in prison, and she is sentenced for 10 years and she was a nurse. And it haunts me and makes me imagine if she is going through similar things, as my father is going through similar things. And when also earlier when I mentioned about surveillance and terror, I just want to share a small anecdote. I was lucky enough to be able to chat with a few of my relatives back in the Uyghur region a while ago. And I forgot what kind of horror they must be living in right now. And I greeted them with our normal greetings before 2013. I greeted them with Assalamu alaikum, which is how I greeted everyone in the beginning of my speech. And that's how Muslim people in the whole world would greet each other. That's I said Assalamu alaikum, and people on the other side of the phone, they freaked out. And when I say Allah Amanet, which is Allah wish you peace, they all freak out and they start saying Xi Jinping Amanet, which is Xi Jinping wish you peace. And they would prefer to use Parti Amanet, which is the Communist Party wish you peace. And this is the amount of pressure they're living in. People are no longer even feel safe to greet you in our culturally or Islamic greetings, traditional greetings words anymore. And this is how much of surveillance people are going through, that they have been under. So when you ask me, what are those workers' conditions? I have to say, for people who are still remained in China, it's very difficult to know. And for people who are outside of China, they're still living under horror because they're worried for their family safety. Just like me, I'm worried at the moment when I'm speaking to you. I fear for my family members' safety. And I really do wish after this meeting, the Chinese government would leave them alone.
Well, listen, thank you very much. And if English is your third language, I'd hate to see how good you are in your first two. So thank you for your words this morning, and best wishes to your family. We're going to move now to the Q&A section where member states will get a chance to speak. And if we have time at the end, civil society and the media. We've roughly 30 minutes. A number of members have already indicated that they want to speak, and they will be given the floor first. Those speaking on behalf of a group will be given 2 minutes. Individual members will be given 1 minute. And because we're not in an Irish bar on a Friday night, I would ask everyone to please respect that so that you give your colleagues a chance to speak as well. And then at the end, time permitting, we will open up to some more questions. But I'm going to start off. The first 4 order of running will be Denmark, Turkey, France, and China. So I would like to start by welcoming the representative for Denmark, who is also going to be speaking for the Nordic and Baltic states. So good morning and thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. First, on a personal note, Jewher, endless admiration and respect for what you're doing and the stance you have taken. I'm delivering this statement on behalf of Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, and Sweden, all co-hosts of today's event. We are gravely concerned about the information presented in reports and statements on human rights situation in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, among others by NGOs such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, both present here today. We are gravely concerned about the reported existence of large networks of so-called political re-education camps, where a very high number of people are held in long-term arbitrary detention. We are equally concerned by efforts to severely restrict the right to freedom of religion or belief, expression, peaceful assembly and association, and the freedoms of movement for Uyghurs and other persons belonging to minority groups, as well as other human rights violations and abuses in Xinjiang. We deplore the widespread surveillance disproportionately targeting ethnic Uyghurs and other individuals belonging to minority groups. We raise our deep concerns about the information brought forward in evidence-based reports, including of forced labor, forced use of birth control, sexual abuse, and forced sterilizations. Human rights, as stipulated in international law and as provided for in China's constitution, must be fully ensured for all persons belonging to religious and ethnic minorities, also in Xinjiang. We also call on China to allow journalists and other media workers to report on the human rights situation in Xinjiang without surveillance, censorship, or fear of retribution. Furthermore, we call on the Chinese government to facilitate immediate, meaningful, and unfettered access to Xinjiang for all relevant UN special procedures and for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And lastly, we strongly regret the Chinese retaliatory decision to sanction institutions and individuals of the EU and European countries as countermeasure to the EU's global human rights sanctions on Chinese officials involved in the human rights violations against the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang. We wish to thank the organizers of this event and to pay tribute to your continuous reporting, awareness raising, and debate on this matter of great concern. I thank you.
Thank you very much. We are now going to move to the representative from Turkey. Good morning, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. Dear friends, UN platforms have a critical role to play in raising the international community's concerns about the treatment of the Uyghur Turks and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang and in conveying our expectations. Therefore, I would like to thank the co-sponsors for organizing this timely meeting and the panelists for their insightful remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms of Uyghur Turks is a major concern for Turkey. Turkey has special ethnic and cultural ties with Uyghurs. We also have a sizable number of citizens of Uyghur origin. We want to see the Uyghur Turks live in peace and prosperity as equal citizens of China with their full rights and freedoms protected by law. The human rights, religious freedoms, and the cultural identity of Uyghur Turks must be respected and guaranteed. Just like the rest of us, the Uyghur Turks should be able to preserve their culture and identity for the generations to come. However, as the findings in various reports of international organizations indicate, the ongoing practices about severe human rights violations in the region are extremely worrying. We voice these serious concerns and our expectations in our bilateral engagements with China. Most recently, we have clearly communicated our views to Foreign Minister Wang Yi during his visit to Turkey on March 24th. We will continue to follow the issue closely and register our position at both bilateral level and multilateral platforms, including the UN and the OIC. We expect the same from the entire membership. We must keep the inhuman treatment of the Uyghur Turks and other Muslim communities in Xinjiang high on the international agenda. Finally, let me take this opportunity to express our support for the initiative of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to ensure immediate, meaningful, and unfettered access to Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We will now move to the representative for France. Good morning, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear friends, the testimonies heard today are appealing, but unfortunately not new. Over the past years, France has denounced many times human rights violations committed against persons belonging to ethnic and religious minorities in Xinjiang, as we would for violations committed anywhere else in the world. Religious freedom is crucial, and human rights are indivisible and universal. No one is above scrutiny. France will continue to raise this issue whenever it is relevant, both bilaterally and in multilateral forums such as the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. We once again encourage the Chinese authorities to allow meaningful and unfettered access to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, ratify and implement the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights they have already signed, and ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. With its European partners, France will continue to follow closely the situation and ensure an appropriate response to the human rights violations committed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will now give the floor to the representative from China. Good morning.
Now, time for truth. First, I make it clear that China is here to tell the truth. It doesn't mean in any way we recognize this event. Second, I strongly request the moderator to give me a fair amount of time to speak. I believe most of the participants want to hear the voice from China. Let me show you a short video that you may never see on your media.
Well, the CIA would want to destabilize China, and that would be the best way to do it, to foment unrest and to join with those Uyghurs in pushing the Han Chinese and Beijing from internal places rather than external.
So the truth is, it's not about human rights in Xinjiang. It's about using Xinjiang as a political tool to contain China. The US and some of its allies make a presumption of guilt and then fabricate so-called evidence. Think of what happened in Iraq, Syria, and Libya. The trick has been played so many times, and everyone knows it. So-called genocide, forced labor, systematic rape, and torture in Xinjiang are lies of the century, which never happened and will never happen in China. I could tell more truths, but you don't give me more time because you reject the truth. Xinjiang Autonomous Region of China has held 40+ press conferences, but your media refuse to report because you fear the truth. China has nothing to hide on Xinjiang. Xinjiang is always open. Over 1,200 diplomats, journalists, scholars from more than 100 countries have visited Xinjiang in past years. We welcome everyone to visit Xinjiang, but we oppose any kind of investigation based on lies and with the presumption of guilt, which no sovereign state could accept. Xinjiang is a beautiful, peaceful, and prosperous place. Your attempt of using Xinjiang to contain China is doomed to fail.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to the representative for Canada.
Well, as we say now for something completely different, I'd like to thank Germany, the United States, and the UK for organizing this event. I'd like to thank people for standing up for human rights. I want to give particular thanks to the panelists and all the survivors and their families who have shared their powerful and poignant stories and provided such critical facts, documentation, and yes, the truth. The Government of Canada supports this event to give voice to the oppressed and to say to those who speak out, we hear you. One victim of the arbitrary detention and other human rights violations and crimes against humanity apparent in Xinjiang is one too many. The evidence of a systematic campaign of repression by Chinese authorities targeting Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang cannot be ignored. Our message to the Chinese government today is clear. We in Canada will continue to speak out in light of this ongoing situation. We will continue to work with the international community to investigate the serious human rights violations and abuses taking place in Xinjiang, discrediting victims, and attempting to silence critics are not the answer, and they're not going to work. We've already taken action in Canada. We've announced a comprehensive approach to addressing the situation in Xinjiang, including measures to address forced labor. We've also announced, joined with international partners, to impose new sanctions on one organization and 4 individuals over gross and systematic human rights violations. We insist on the need for investigation and accountability. We call on China to halt the repression, and we implore other members of the international community to join with us in standing up for human rights in Xinjiang. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We will now move to the representative from Japan. Good morning, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. As the representatives of many countries expressed, Japan shared the deep concern about human rights situation in Xinjiang and has urged repeatedly the government of China to take positive, concrete actions. Japan was part of the joint statement on the human rights situation in Xinjiang in the UN Third Committee in October last year, and the latest G7 foreign ministers communique issued earlier this month also highlighted this issue. In addition, Foreign Minister of Japan, Mr. Motegi, directly raised this issue to Mr. Wang Yi, State Councilor and Foreign Minister of China, in their phone conversation last April. I would like to point out that it is particularly important to grant independent and unfettered access to Xinjiang, as G7 foreign ministers called for such access for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in their communique. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We will now move to the representative from Slovakia. Good morning, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Slovakia is one of the co-sponsors. Would like to thank the panelists for sharing really important information and raising awareness about the human rights situation in Xinjiang. It is important to discuss these issues and also addressed. It was also addressed in June 2020 in the letter by 50 UN Special Procedures mandate holders. We are gravely concerned about the reports of severe restrictions on the freedoms of religion or belief, movement, association, and expression, as well as about arbitrary detention, widespread surveillance, and forced labor enforce the birth control, particularly targeting Uyghurs and other minorities in Xinjiang. Since China repeatedly confirmed its willingness to do so, we believe that allowing the UN High Commissioner and Special Procedure Mandate holders a meaningful and unfettered access to Xinjiang at the earliest opportunity would be the right avenue to take. Full respect for all human rights everywhere is a cornerstone of a modern society, and there must be no pretext of national sovereignty that could change this approach. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we will hear from the representative from Australia. Good morning.
Well, good morning. Thanks, Dimitri, and good morning, colleagues. We're pleased to support this morning's event through Australia's co-sponsorship. Australia is a staunch defender of human rights, as well as the values and the principles shared between liberal democracies. To this end, we will continue to speak out and support action on human rights violations and abuses around the world. The Australian government shares the grave concerns of the international community about the growing number of credible reports of severe human rights abuses and violations against ethnic Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, including restrictions on freedom of religion, mass surveillance, large-scale extrajudicial detentions, as well as forced labour and forced birth control, including sterilisation. Australia's Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, has consistently raised our concerns directly with China, as well as in her Human Rights Council dignitary addresses. Most recently, colleagues, the Foreign Minister set out Australia's serious concerns in a joint statement with New Zealand Foreign Minister Mahuta. Australia again underscores the importance of transparency and accountability. We call on China to grant urgent, meaningful and unfettered access to Xinjiang for United Nations experts, including UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Bachelet. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much. Next, we're going to hear from the representative from Italy. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Italy remains deeply concerned about human rights violations and abuses in Xinjiang, targeting ethnic and religious minority groups, and we take this opportunity to reiterate our call on China to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. Our concerns focus specifically on evidence-based reports about the existence of a large network of political re-education camps, widespread surveillance, systemic restrictions on freedom of religion or belief against Uyghurs and other minorities, as well as about forced labor, forced sterilization, forced birth control, and sexual and gender-based violence. With specific regard to forced labor, we reaffirm the importance of tackling this problem, including through raising awareness and providing advice and support for our business communities. We also reiterate the European Union's call on China to ratify the ICCPR, the ILO Conventions number 29, including its 2014 protocol, and number 105 on forced labor without delay. Finally, we strongly support the request for an independent and unfettered access to Xinjiang for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in order to conduct an independent, objective, impartial, and transparent assessment of the issues of concern already identified by the UN independent experts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have two more member states who are going to speak. First, we're going to go to the Netherlands. Good morning. Is the representative from the Netherlands with us? If not, we can skip ahead to the representative from Luxembourg and then come back to the representative from the Netherlands after that.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much to the organizers and the panelists, and especially to Jewher again for today's event. Luxembourg is, as our virtual presence documents, very concerned about the dramatic situation of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim minorities in Xinjiang. It is both a human rights and a humanitarian crisis. We call for immediate, meaningful, and unfettered access to the region, to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UN treaty bodies, representatives, and relevant special procedures mandate holders. We expect, encourage, and are confident that UN instances and bodies will resist pressure and maintain the situation in Xinjiang on the agenda of our organization. The role of the Human Rights Council and of the Third Committee of the General Assembly will be instrumental in this regard. Other avenues which have been mentioned today could and should also be considered if, and there are few of them, existing instruments prove to be insufficient. Thank you very much once more for today's event.
Thank you very much. And let me try again. If the ambassador from the Netherlands is present, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you see and hear me now, and good morning.
Good morning.
I would like to thank the non-governmental organizations for this informative event that they organized together with a broad group of member states. And as a co-sponsor, the Kingdom of the Netherlands reiterates its support for having this timely event because we are concerned about the grave human rights violations in Xinjiang, which the panelists today have clearly highlighted. Like others, we feel it is essential that the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights and other independent observers gain immediate and meaningful and unhindered access to the region. The situation in Xinjiang must be investigated, and those responsible have to be held accountable. We call on all UN member states to continue to call for access, accountability, and for the release of Uyghurs wrongfully detained in Xinjiang. And finally, I would like to echo the words of my colleague from Denmark in expressing our concern about the measures of China against persons in the EU as a response to EU global human rights sanctions on the basis of violations in Xinjiang. I thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the representatives for their comments. We have time for a couple of questions from people who are viewing. The first, we're going to go to the Ilham Tohti Initiative. I'm not sure who's going to speak on your behalf, but you have the floor. Good morning. Do we have someone from the Ilham Tohti Initiative with us?
Yes.
Yes, good morning. The floor is yours.
Yes, good evening, good afternoon. I am based in, sorry?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead with your question.
Okay. My name is Enver Can. I live in Germany, and 5 years ago, we created the Ilham Tohti Initiative to help to promote his ideas and him in the Western democracies. So I have a brief comment, my comment and question. My question is, as long as economic interests are above human rights and above the universal values, there will be no respect by China on human rights. So my question, can the democracies unite on a coherent policy towards China, towards the Western expansion of China? So I will say only a united front, only a global coalition with a common language, without double standards, backed up with economic sanctions, will have an impact on dictatorships, especially the CCP, to respect human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Perhaps based on some of the comments earlier, Agnes or Ken, would you like to weigh in on that question?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Dimi. I mean, as I mentioned, I think the Western democracies, frankly, are coming together on Xinjiang. But what is needed for broad UN action, actually get a resolution through the Human Rights Council or through the General Assembly, is the involvement of other governments. And that will require, active outreach from the West. For example, where are the Latin American democracies? Increasingly, they have a pro-human rights foreign policy, but they've been cowed by China, and we need to get past that. Where are the democratic African states? And perhaps most important, where are the moderate Muslim majority members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation? I mentioned how, despite the usual reluctance to take on human rights in particular countries, many OIC members were willing to help with the situation of the Rohingya Muslims when they're being persecuted by Myanmar. And they supported the creation of a special investigative mechanism. They supported Human Rights Council condemnations. They supported a World Court genocide case against Myanmar. That was all great. Why not for the Uyghur Muslims? And the fact that China is powerful isn't a sufficient answer. So I think we need to continue pressing, build a really global coalition, and that's how we can have significant UN action.
Thank you very much. And our final question from a journalist, and I apologize if I'm going to mispronounce your name, Marie Vlaskamp. And could you just give your affiliation when you introduce yourself as well? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Dimitri. My name is Marije Vlaskamp. I'm from the Volkskrant, which is a Dutch newspaper. And I have a question, I think, for Fernand de Varenne, because he's the only one here from a UN body. Today we saw the release of another report from James Leibold, an OSPI think tank in Australia, which said that in Xinjiang, especially in districts where there are a lot of Uyghurs, there are declining birth rates, almost at 50% due to Chinese enforced birth policy and birth controls. We've seen a lot of reports, as the French UN ambassador already said, on these kind of allegations. From your international experience, when is the international community reaching a tipping point? What kind of reports do we still lack to reach a tipping point in international public opinion to push through for other actions than the ones that we are already trying, like the unfettered access for the Special High Commissioner? In your experience in earlier human rights abuses, when do you see a certain tipping point existing, and where are we on that roadmap to that tipping point?
I don't think we can identify any obvious tipping point. What needs to be done is to increase our understanding of what is happening on the ground, the extent it is happening, and the gravity or the horrific nature of some of the allegations which are occurring. In other words, we need much more of the same, but as one of the previous speakers indicated, we, in my opinion, we need to have the international community even more fully engaged, including the United Nations and its various entities, so that we can try to determine as fairly and objectively possible what is occurring in Xinjiang itself on the ground. There are many media reports. There are, in fact, many other efforts to actually try to arrive at some kind of conclusions. But at the end of the day, as a multilateral entity, we must be able to actually verify ourselves, once again, fairly and objectively, the extent of the veracity, if you will, of the allegations being made. So just perhaps to be as clear as possible, there's no easy tipping point, but certainly we need to engage, member states need to engage with the United Nations and other multilateral organizations such as the OIC to try to get clarity, certainty, and actually understand what is occurring on the ground. If I can, as an independent expert, I cannot express a judgment, if you will, at this point on a number of the allegations that have been raised. But on the other hand, I think it is extremely important that as a multilateral organization, the United Nations be much more involved and actually try to gather all of the forces that are interested in addressing extremely serious, massive allegations of atrocities and violations of human rights. So I would propose that kind of answer to say that more of the same has to be done, but also much more has to be done at the multilateral level with the United Nations and the OIC and others. And also much more needs to be done by members of the international community. Because
why do you think the UN at this moment, well, in your own words, is timid and not involved enough? Because, well, that's the place everybody's looking at. Everybody's looking at your organization. What do you think is the main explanation for their timidity?
I'm sure I didn't use the word timidity, but I would say, however, that the United Nations has an extremely fundamental role to play in preventing, obviously, the violations of human rights, but also preventing conflict. And what we have here is the possibility, if I may be so bold, of a very destabilizing environment being created. Destabilizing for China, destabilizing also in other parts of the region. And so I think that the United Nations as a multilateral organization has a significant repertoire of tools at its disposal. I actually mentioned a few of them earlier on. It can emanate from the Security Council, the General Assembly, or the Human Rights Council. I think these need to be explored much more aggressively, both within the entity itself, the United Nations, but also member states of the UN have to look at all of these possible tools. Once again, however, may I emphasize that it's important to establish a dialogue with the country involved, as we should be doing with any situation of allegations of horrific and massive violations of human rights.
Thank you very much to both of you and to everyone else for your comments and your questions. As we move towards closing out the event, our final remarks are going to come from Dolkun Esa, who is the president of the World Uyghur Congress. I think Dolkun is going to speak to us from Germany. Good evening, Dolkun. It must be dark there.
Hi, thank you, Dimitri. Assalamu alaikum, hanımlar, efendiler. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from Germany. Your Excellencies Ambassador Woodward, Thomas Greenfield, and Huysigen, and all other speakers. I would like to thank co-sponsor member states and the Human Rights Organization for organizing this very important event. This could not have been more timely. As we speak, Uyghurs are losing everything dear to them, next to losing their rights, freedom, and dignity. They are also losing their friends, family, and loved ones. Throughout my works as a human rights defender, I have lost my mother, who died in the concentration camp in May 2018. My father in uncertain condition. I still don't know about my two brothers' whereabouts. However, my situation is far from unique. Uyghur and the other Turkic people in diaspora have all come to share our similar faiths. We are talking about largest internment since the Holocaust. In the last 5 years alone, Uyghurs have been subject to forced sterilization, forced labor, sexual abuse, torture, cultural destruction, and family separations. This issue has been politicized by the Chinese government at the UN, and it is doing everything in its power to silence human rights defenders at the UN. For past 4 or 5 years, we have been calling on the United Nations to take urgent action. There have been some major advances, particularly from treaty bodies, special procedures, mandated holders, but there has been no single concrete action taken by Human Rights Council. No urgent resolution has been introduced. No special session has been proposed. No agreement has been reached between Office of the High Commissioners and the Chinese government on unlimited access to the region. On the other hand, some governments are openly promoting Chinese government repressive policy against Uyghur and the other Turkic people. Some of those countries are Muslim majority country. They should be ashamed for the silence in such urgent and dire times. OIC countries have moral responsibility to also protect Uyghur and the Turkic Muslim. happy last day of the Ramadan. Unfortunately, I cannot say happy Ramadan to my people, Uyghurs, today. In the face of the Uyghur genocide and China's threat to the UN human rights mechanism and to the civil society space, the UN needs to act in line with its own core values. This includes establishment of the Commission of Inquiry by the Human Rights Council, appointment of special rapporteur on China, but most importantly, UN High Commissioners exercising her independent remote and monitoring and reporting mandating. The UN Secretary General should break his silence and support this monitoring effort and urge Chinese government to end this genocide. UN member states should support mechanism to hold Chinese government accountable. UN experts and the treaty body must continue to document and report to severe abuses against Uyghurs and the Turkic people. Uyghur cannot end this genocide alone. We seek urgent action from the UN and its member states. Silence and the neutrality in the face of an ongoing genocide, meaning being accomplice of the genocide and the crime against humanity. Thank you.
Dolkun, thank you very much. You have the final word today, because unfortunately we have run out of time. And I have to say, as I was listening to everyone's comments, I was thinking back to 1998 when I was actually a student in China, and I traveled with my camera across Xinjiang and took photographs of many fantastic kids who I met along the way. And as I kind of read about what's happening in Xinjiang and listen to your description of the situation, I can't help but wondering, where are those children now and do they have their freedom? This is clearly a critical issue for the world, and I think we look forward to lots more conversations. So on that note, I would like to thank everyone for taking part and ask the audience to give a virtual round of applause to the participants and to our viewers, wherever you are. Thank you again for spending your time with us today. Thanks a million and goodbye. Take care.